Tom Warwick slouched back into the couch and stared at his omnipad, while Miv fixed him coffee. There was only so much damage you could do to the process, and while cooking was not her forte, she'd gotten it down to add the grinds over the filter, check the water, and push 2 buttons. The mixture dripped out into the cup and voila! Coffee. It was a process that you could do any number of ways, from a drip to a French press, but it was the results that mattered, and the universe would pry his beloved DeLonghi coffee/espresso maker from his cold dead hands. But in the end, it was still coffee. You could get good coffee, or, if you didn't change the filter, bad coffee. Burnt coffee and bad beans. You could ruin a cup of coffee, but it was still coffee. Tom set down the first portion of Jama's paper comparing humanity to the Urgerans, as Miv brought over his mug and nodded his thanks. He was in the zone, and she understood. More often, the shoe was on the other foot, when she was writing and he fixed her dinner. Right now, he was focused, and Miv, Leia and Solani didn't just let him be, they catered to him as they kept one another company. Slouching into the couch with one of his wives and his fiancée after a leisurely breakfast to read was nice, domestic, normal, for a value of normal. Of course, it was harder to do with Shalea nestled into his right. She and Miv were leaving his left side open for Solani, and watched over her anxiously. Given the loss of her arm, the position wasn't really comfortable for her, but they made the effort to have her feel at home. After screwing up her nerve, she slipped in beside him with a worried smile, one that blossomed after he patted her on the thigh. Solani had a nice smile. He put it on his list of things he wanted to see more often. The 3 of them took it in turns to watch over Deshin, who spent most of the time in her chair. It wasn't that her muscles had atrophied, so much as she was relearning how to use them. Her movements came in fits and starts, and the chair was easier for now. Tom swiped Jama's paper aside and collected his thoughts over a first sip of coffee. It all came down to rocks and nukes, the Flintstones and the Jetsons, all written into one gigantic tragedy. He scratched his cheek as he stared at his omnipad, feeling the stubble. It would be time to shave later. Miv, do you remember when I took you to see Pompei? Mivere paused from her own work and made a happy sound of affirmation, while Leia dozed. Solani stirred and looked at them both, canting her head. Who's Pompei? One of your musicians? It's an ancient city on Earth. About 2,000 of our years ago, the whole area was buried by a volcanic explosion, Tom explained. After it was rediscovered, it became a historic monument that people can walk through. I thought it was charming, Mivere nodded. The bedrooms were tiny, but the houses had beautiful courtyards with central gardens. I wish I could have seen it, Solani said wistfully. Miv said something in return, but Tom fiddled with his notes, letting their conversation slide past him. Mivere had liked Pompei. More than that, she'd understood Pompei. It was a city, and while she compared the style to Helcom architecture and hadn't been impressed by the age, she'd gotten it. An alien from countless thousands of light years away, and thousands of years in technology, had readily grasped everyday life in Roman Italy, and spent her time fascinated with the murals. Rocks and nukes. Somewhere along the line of developing technology, you started by picking up a rock and ended with developing a nuke. They were opposite ends of the spectrum, but they seemed to be firm limits. On one hand, you had a rock, a basic tool. You could carve wood and bash together a wooden building with one, like the proto-humans had over 470,000 years ago. Or you could hit someone in the head. Tom vaguely recalled his surprise when his family tree revealed how his great-great-grandfather had been accidentally killed by one thrown during a fight. He was pretty sure that somewhere during the Resistance, someone must have attacked a Shilvanti with one. It was a rock, and a rock was a rock. On the other hand was a nuke. There were clean nukes and dirty nukes, big nukes and suitcase nukes, neutron bombs and H-bombs and fission nukes. You could drop one from a B-29, or you could put one on an ICBM, or you could lob it from deep orbit, but a nuke was a nuke. Splitting the atom in an uncontrolled release of energy was a devastating weapon, but it was the far edge of devastation the universe could provide, short of a supernova. According to JAMA, the Shorvanti had eliminated 4 other races deemed too hostile to be let loose in the galaxy, though the sentient, all-devouring slime was hard to argue with. The question of the Ulnas was still murky, but the Shorvanti had certainly tried. And what did they do? They nudged the trajectory of a massive planetoid out in the Oort cloud, gave it a push, and bam! 8 months later it smashed the planet into floating rubble, which was nothing more than hitting someone with a rock. And when you came down to it, what was so impressive about a nuke? It was 1940s technology, but if you'd shown people from the 50s an iPhone and told them you'd landed on the moon, they'd have been a lot more impressed with the phone. They'd probably ask if I went to work on a jetpack and owned a flying car. It was like that idiotic crossover cartoon, where the Flintstones met the Jetsons. Someone from the 50s would be really impressed by the internet and cell phones and VR rigs, but they'd readily understood how to use it all, just like Mavere had understood Pompei. The Shorvanti had starships and fusion power and anti-gravity, and if you wanted to look at weapons, they had lasers and space torpedoes and tungsten rods from God and exosuits like Iron Man. But at the far end of the spectrum, they were still constrained by the limits of nature and physics. A nuke. And the Shorvanti did not like nuclear weapons. The Urgens, the Shorvanti's next-door neighbours, decimated themselves so completely that the Shorvanti took notice around the time they developed their first radio telescopes, to say nothing of what the Shor found when they made their first interstellar voyage. Small wonder they hate the things. So when the Imperium found humanity with our nukes and climate problems and all the rest, they thought they were saving us. Maybe they were. Who knows? But what they weren't impressed with were our iPhones. Tom fingered his Omnipad and grimaced. It was an order of magnitude more powerful than his old iPhone 12 he'd still been carrying around when the Imperium showed up. Why would they be? Imperial technology was light years ahead of Earth's, but like all good technology, once you got past how it was made, function was one thing, but design inevitably turned towards ease of use, and humanity understood how to use cell phones, just like we understood rocks and nukes. Tom stared at his note page after closing out the first chapter. The next one dived into the Urgerans and what the Shorvanti knew about their culture. He flipped back over the first chapter, picking out what he'd underlined before opening his notes page. He pursed his lips, muttering as he scribbled one entry. Don't mention the damn flying cars. Stop staring and don't believe everything you read, Sunchaser grumbled sotto voce as she pulled Rikishi along in her wake. That was a trick in itself. The menus on graphic display along the entry offered 1,001 delights, but it was crappy advertising. Given the potential combinations in species, genders, to the number of acts on offer, the actual number was far higher. Whatever you do, just walk like we own this place. There was enough wealth on display in the foyer alone to make her pelt quiver, but you never let it show. To her credit, Rikishi was doing her best, trying to keep her mind on the job, although her eyes darted to the menu now and then. The old Pathfinder nodded with pride. Even she had to admit the scent in the hot tub caught her eye. If she was a few cycles younger, she'd... What is that? Rikishi's eyes were large as plates as she followed Sunchaser's gaze. And what is it doing? Sunchaser sighed at being caught out at the very thing she told the kid not to do. She might be older, but she wasn't dead. That one? He's a synth. Ah, and the tongue? Yep, tongue's real. Sunchaser nodded and stopped in the hall. It wasn't like other women weren't going over the lunch menu with glee, and it helped to look like they had the credits. And yes, it is prehensile. Those skinny little guys can... What? Rikishi's eyes had gone from plates to platters. You mean you and... The girl made a snake-like twitch of her psyche that wasn't lost on her tutor and looked like she wanted to wriggle out of her skin. Sunchaser gestured dismissively at the sign, though she had to admit it stirred fond memories. See that bowl of chagava he's holding in his left hand? Chagava? Ethnic dish. Fermented warax milk whipped to a mousse, mixed with karasi sugar and finely chopped gava nuts. Sunchaser glared at a woman walking near with enough gemstones on display to pay for half a year's ship maintenance. Well, 4 months. The big gemstone was a fake. Sunchaser glared harder, and the woman hurried out of earshot. Gava nuts are great protein, and the froth milk is delicious. So it's part of the restaurant menu? Rikishi looked like she was fighting to stand still, and Sunchaser thanked her foresight in making the girl take the blockers. Bad enough the Persian boy was supposed to be a morsel, but if he was putting off pheromones... She made a note to go rub up against Lathkiar later. Sunchaser nodded slowly. It wouldn't do any harm to educate the girl. Not exactly. Seen the note? It's also a spa treatment. Rikishi caught Sunchaser's eye and bit the off at once. That kind of thing didn't do for a pathfinder. It looked indecisive. That is, yes. Acts like a great conditioner and gives your pelt a terrific sheen. She sniffed at happy memories. The warband hadn't been anywhere near Sem space in decades, but, in her youth. Before the bath, it's rubbed in with a long massage. Oh. And then you lick it off each other. Sunchaser took Rikishi's hand and put some sway in her thoughts as she made her way to the entrance. She didn't have all night to waste on fond memories. Come on, we're burning daylight. Besides, she already knew what she was shopping for. It was time to see the manager. Belder watched as her friend slipped out of the cabin. Liam, did you say anything to Pris? Say anything? Liam looked frozen to his chair and she nearly laughed. Nothing bad, silly. It's just, she hasn't been herself. I think she's interested and you haven't said a thing. Belder eased down into the chair next to his and took his hand gently. It's not like her to just slip off like that. I'm kind of worried. Liam was already turning pink. Belle, I haven't said anything to her, honestly. I mean, not like that. Pris is great, but we're going to see your family. Exactly. Exactly. And, wait, what? Liam shook his head in the adorable way he had, where he asked a question without canting his head. It was just so utterly him, and she patted his hand. He usually understood how to deal with women, but sometimes he could be so naive. Belder, how could you expect me to start seeing a girl in front of your family? She pursed her lips and sighed, trying not to look too matronizing. When else would you do it? It's not like your matriarch is coming, so of course they'll be interested. What did you think was going to happen? That I'd set you up with one of my 8 sisters or 15 cousins? I mean, ew. That many? I mean, no. That is, yes, I want to settle down with you. Liam licked his lips. It's just, I grew up with the Imperium my whole life, but Pris? Now? Really? Of course, Pris. And why not now? She's one of my best friends. It's up to you, of course. It's not like we're married. Belder looked down, studying his hands in hers, and unable to meet his eyes. Not yet. I mean, you aren't changing your mind, are you? What? No! Liam pulled her hands into his lap, and she blushed slightly at the force of his words. I just wanted some for us, you know. Liam wasn't a masculine guy by Shul standards, but he was human, and in her eyes he was perfect. She blushed as more stray thoughts came to mind. That's why now is perfect. I haven't said a thing to Pris, and she hasn't pushed. She's a good friend and wouldn't do that. Honestly, Willis might be hard for her to settle there. It's rural. You're interested, aren't you? A home there? And a family? There's no one back in Canada, but I'm not even sure what that means, Belle. A family? Liam looked into his lap. Are your parents going to think I'm failing you? How will we deal with it? I mean, what's the point? What's the purpose if I can't give you a chance for a family? I live on a ranch, Belda sighed, twisted a lock of her hair. It wasn't the kind of talk she expected to be having. Not because Liam was a human, but because of her home. Awkward as it was, she braced herself and faced it. One of the big ones, where everyone's family. Just wait till you meet my Uncle Kelra. Your uncle? It's complicated, but he never had kids, and I surely wouldn't say he's got no purpose. He holds our whole family together. He helped raise me, helped raise my sisters and cousins, watches over the herds, watches over us. When I think of Uncle Kelra, all I see is a man with purpose, Belda said softly, wishing he'd look up. Maybe that's yours too. You don't have to give me children for us to have a family. Liam looked like he was going to say something, then stopped, licking his lips, before nodding slowly. After a moment, he looked up at her. That feels like relief to a problem I hadn't really thought about. I appreciate that. A lot. I love you too. You're the man I want to spend my life with. Belda felt the smile rising up inside, and leaned over to kiss his cheek. Now, will you please go out and see Pris? I will absolutely die if I bring a fiancé home who doesn't have a girlfriend. Seriously? 23 eligible sisters and cousins, she said slowly, leaning in close and resting her forehead on his. 23. I'll go talk to Pris. As manager of the tide pool, Arada Calderis' work was never done. In the comfort of his office, he perused the latest report from the firing range, and mused over the request for sticky munitions. While non-lethal, it lacked the stopping power he preferred. If the Silver Sun's bitches regained the strength to come sniffing around, his girls would chop their tits off. While anything too destructive was a bad idea inside your own house, the stuff never came out of the carpets. Regardless, it paid to plan with the long view. Lady Simila's accords wouldn't last forever, and the Sun's ambitions always seemed to outweigh their sense. He shelved a decision for after the lunchtime show, pulling up the makeup requisition from the costumes department. Costs were in hand for everything but the leatherware, and... He looked up as his door chimed at admittance, and smiled as Harem slipped gracefully inside. Harem had worked his way up to maître d'œuvre, and he'd be a good successor one day, but Arada noted the worry on his face. The man was a consummate hand with handling matters. Arada set his omnipad aside and fingered one tusk speculatively. Whatever it was, it would probably be interesting. You look worried, Haram. Alreda blithely waved into a chair. That's not allowed before lunch, not for anything less than a princess or the building catching fire. Haram gave a half-hearted shrug, but didn't take the preferred seat. Boss, we have 2 pairs in here, and they want to see you. Oh. Of all the myriad species in the galaxy, the last one any sensible restaurateur wanted to see was a Pezrin. Still, his predecessor warned him this day would come, and old Atra was proven right, as usual. Since Pass got caught up with his enigmatic little bit of tail, security first reported a Pezrin woman scoping their work, then a Pezrin girl at the bar who'd been taken home, by a human no less. Now it was 2 Pezrin at once? It was a dangerous trend, but it could still prove an opportunity. Strange days indeed. Back when the Suns appeared, Atra cut a deal with the Rifkian warband to train the security, and it had paid handsome dividends. The warband had trained the staff, while the staff showed the warband a very good time. Today, the Taipul's security was as capable as it was discreet. A perfect meeting of minds. It had been fabulously expensive to install new sub-basements, the safe rooms, the lavish outlay for weaponry, body armor, ammunition and hair care, but it had proven its worth. The Suns had been aggressive and the Taipul a choice target. Beneath the lust and lavish facade flowed a thriving trade, smuggling everything from casks of real Anther battle glory to objects to art. Everything but men. Well, men and mint. The Tidewall had been a perfect venture for Atra and his silent partner, and when the nobility came in droves... He paused at the unexpected pun. When the nobility came, the sons had tried to follow. His predecessor had denied them with all the lethality and discretion that only quality catering could provide. The bargain had been Atra's masterpiece, and the Tidewall gained a surety over its future, backed by enough firepower to arm 2 imperial companies, mechanized support notwithstanding. A good deal for everyone, until the Rivagian vanished. Cautious inquiries had failed to turn up any rumours, but 3 days later, when a Nightcrew courier appeared at their cargo entrance with a note, and a young Pezrin boy. And this day has been coming ever since. According to security, the women snooping around were both Natasha, and while Past was confused about how to deal with one of their daughters, he did appear smitten. Perhaps not quite so much after that banquet, but still. Work, work, work. So, young love has finally washed in. Alrada smiled blissfully at Haram. Species courtship is an important skill. I've read up on it. Why do you think I'm worried? Haram gave a distinctly indelicate shudder. You weren't there to clean up Past when he came crawling home. And what if they start to sing? It was unconventional, I'll grant you, and remarkably free of bribery. Alrada mused. Arranging trysts for the guests was too pedestrian for management, but courtships were another matter. The high stakes for a young man's happiness, as well as the vast sums of money paid for his dowry, made it a thrill. My research on the Natasja shows they have possibilities. They're barely solvent, and they're working for Duchess Varun. Hiram fanned the air while rolling his eyes expansively. That's more irony than I find palatable. Hiram, you have to look for intangible assets. Alrada felt his heart flutter at the heady prospect of a high-stakes negotiation. Past is a fine young man, and coming along well to take over as maître d'œuvre? Well, he's never put himself on the menu, but the clients think he's a cuddly appetizer, and he knows how to sway his tail. Hiram frowned thoughtfully. 2, maybe 3 years? A fine thing, too. Is a truth galactically acknowledged that a young man possessed of a good fortune must be in want of wives? Alrada smiled like the sun emerging from the clouds. Ideally with good fortunes, but huge rates of fire are a perfectly suitable substitute. Do show them in. True love is calling. Let's take advantage. Liam slipped through the passageways, but stopped short of the galley. The crew loitered there, and while the ship seemed all right, it wasn't the sort of place to go on his own. A crowd of spacers with no leave in weeks or months. That was a lot worse than any marine bar back home, and not a safe bet. Not that the Marines were a big problem. The Imperium had settled in, and once you got right down to it, things were pretty good. Sure, you couldn't get car parts for classics built before 2019, but who cared? Human women were rising up the ranks of corporations and sector governments, learning the ropes from Imperial administrators. And who cared? It wasn't like he'd wanted a government job. If it was you against the world, bet on the world. And versus the galaxy? The galaxy won hands down, and all they wanted was the forms filled out right. Most of the world just went on, though the winters getting colder every year had kind of sucked. But it was Canada. Everyone older than him just nodded and talked about the old days, and someday he guessed his young days would be someone else's old days. But until he'd come to Shill, he'd always expected his old days would be back home on Earth. Of course I wanted to see Hope, and then I met Belle. Hooking up hadn't been anything he'd expected, but like everything else, his life was something that happened when he wasn't looking. Still, having Belder was unexpected. Sure, Shulvanti girls had a reputation back home, but she was just who she was. He couldn't give her kids, and Belder said she was okay with it. When he looked at her, he could believe that she believed it too. No one had ever told him they loved him that much. Definitely none of his girlfriends back home. Certainly not Tyler. With Hope gone, Tyler had raised him, but there hadn't been any love lost between them. Belder loved him, and he loved her, but a girlfriend wanting him to have a girlfriend? How did that work? Liam paused at the crosswalk outside the galley and listened to the crew. Bella told him they were giving Pris shit, which was another reason to keep away. All because she wasn't sleeping with him. It was bad enough that the crew were talking about him like a piece of meat, and Belle wouldn't even say what they'd asked her. But Pris had been gone for a couple of hours, and there wasn't anything to do on a freighter. She should have been back. Liam moved on from the galley, checking out the commons. He found her sitting alone in the ship's gymnasium, with her back to the door. Hey, Pris? Are you alright? Pris's back stiffened before standing up and brushing off her jumpsuit. Hi. If you want to use the gym, I can go get Belder to keep watch. She still hadn't looked him in the eye, and while his grasp of body language could sometimes be a little shaky, he knew that wasn't good. Actually, I'd like to see you, if you don't mind. To talk? Liam moved into the door, blocking it off. There were times being a tall guy mattered a lot in the world of Shulvanti women, though it wasn't a big gym, and the hatch was kinda small. Is everything okay? At least Pris had to meet his eye. Pris lifted her chin. Everything is fine, Liam. Okay. She said it in Vatico instead of English, but Liam knew a red alert when he heard it. Fine was never fine. It's just, I've seen you looking my way, and... Liam squirmed inside, but there was over a day left with them sharing a room together. This wasn't a conversation he could have with Belle there, and this was only going to get worse. Belle wants to know if you and I want to, see each other. Confusion flickered over her face. I'm seeing you right now. I mean, see you. Like, date? Liam clutched at the explanation, at a loss where to go. You two are best friends. I don't want to get in the way of that, you know? He wasn't sure what reaction he'd get, but Priscilla drew a long breath and sighed. Don't worry, that won't happen. I never push myself on a guy that thinks I'm ugly. What? Wait, ugly? Are you kidding? Liam stared. Priscilla Tassane was full-faced, with dark hair worn down just barely reaching to her shoulders. Her manners were perfect, and while he didn't know her well, she'd always been so composed. Like she knew who she was and where and why. There wasn't any uncertainty to the girl, which made seeing it now so odd. Pris, you are not ugly. Then why won't you even look at me? Pris said hotly, before drawing in on herself. She folded her arms over her chest, huddling into herself. Not even once. Liam's mouth went dry, but he didn't move out of the door. He probably should have, but if the conversation ended like this, it might never be right. And he might cost Belle her best friend. Back home, guys aren't supposed to look at other girls when they're dating someone. Not that way. Well, I know I haven't met your matriarch. I didn't think it would matter if Belder didn't mind. Priscilla muttered bitterly. I got the feeling she wanted me to, if you were okay about it, to see. Oh, she does. Trust me, she really does. Liam toned it down as Pris glanced up. Wrong impressions were easy, and it already felt like he was fucking this up. He started over. She approves of the idea. She was just leaving it to me, I guess. Oh, I'm sorry I pressed myself on you, Pris sighed. I promise not to make it awkward for the trip. This is your vacation, and you should enjoy yourself. I want you to have a good time too, Pris. Liam swallowed. Look, it's not that I don't like looking at you, and, well, I kind of peeked when you were changing. It's just I don't really know you. You peeked. Priscilla blinked, biting her lower lip. Yeah, I felt pretty bad about it, but, you know, guy, 2 girls. I feel kind of awful admitting it, but you peeked. Yeah. Liam looked at Pris, who seemed to be struggling not to smile like the weight of the world was off her shoulders. I want you to know that I apologize and accept it. Pris had to stop herself from hugging him, and for a wonder, he hadn't flinched. So, can we be friends? I mean, maybe start fresh? Pris offered up her fist a bump and gave him a firm nod, but she was smiling. Priscilla Tassane, I'm very pleased to meet you. Liam had never bothered much about his future, but right now one was standing right there, offering to bump fists. Sunchaser grumbled under her breath as she studied Alrada. The little Shorvanti was cunning enough to be a pathfinder. With anyone less worldly, the fish buffet he'd ordered in would have been a master stroke. There was a lavish spread of potted slug, and Rikishi's nose was twitching in delight at the scent of grilled sliced sea carp. Sunchaser was glad they'd eaten earlier, but still. After the deal. Definitely after the deal. It's not a bribe after the deal is done. Her stomach threatened to rumble anyway. My dear, I have to look out for past future. A young man finds little dignity in poverty, Alrada said breezily as he tucked into brunch. His aide, a fellow named Hiram, was waving the plates about with a sense of presentation that was almost perfect. Dignity and an empty net is only worth the empty net. And he knew. That much was clear. Sunchaser knew her people, and for all their virtues and faults, Pezrin were Pezrin. Evolution on a tidally locked world had given them a deep appreciation for food, and an acute sense of smell. The one went with the other when it came to survival, and mating. And dark mother hang him, the little blue bastard knew it. The little Shorvanti was willing to haggle, but it would have been so much easier if he didn't know what he had on his hands. There's going to be interest from other warbands, Alrada sniffed. I have considered reaching out to the Maraktan. A bit of competition is in past's interests, after all. It would have been easy to resent Alrada if she didn't admire him, but she'd known anyone she'd had to deal with here would be better dressed. But two can play that game. That may be, but I still haven't laid eyes on the boy. I'm not paying a high price for a flimsy piece. Sunchaser huffed mildly, with a dismissive flick of her Asaic. You sent for him ages ago. You didn't call ahead. I'm certain he wants to be properly groomed for yourself and Miss Rikishi here. Just give... Armada waved dismissively, blowing the aroma of thickly spiced araqui across the table, but paused when his door chimed. Why, there he is. Sunchaser was rewarded by the sight of the lad as he entered the room. Good morning, sir. You wanted to... Shit! To his credit, the boy only looked like he'd walked into a wall. Rikishi had certainly taken the blockers. Boy smell could take a powerful hold on a young woman, and past was a fine-looking morsel. But Alrada? For all his virtues as an adversary, the Shorvanti hadn't done the same for past. And Rikishi smells like Senshiki. He's already imprinting on her sister, and Rikishi is young, nubile, and just as rare and juicy as a fresh Auroch steak. Not that a Shorvanti would notice. It was love at first scent. Using her apprentice wasn't fair, but love was love, and business was business. Sunchaser tried not to murr in satisfaction. Rikishi looked like she wanted to squirm out of her skin, but she kept her eyes cast downward. But Alrada knew his business too. Haram, why don't you take Past and Miss Rikishi out to the portico? It's a lovely morning. Alrada caught his aide's eye and shrugged. It's a lovely morning for a Pezrin. Do chaperone our young man and his guest, won't you? Sunchaser waved as Alrada's assistant escorted the boy and Rikishi out of the room. Past did smell good, and 50 cycles ago she'd have been on him. It was a fine thing, and right now all she wanted to do was roll around in her victory. Well, and maybe have some of the grilled garp. I see, Alrada said as the door closed, and he spun around in his chair, leaning forward to study her. I never imagined the effect would be so pronounced. It wouldn't have worked if they didn't have compatible Garakret. Sunchaser knew how to be gracious in victory, and kept the flicker in her Asaya out of view. Well, the nose knows. Remarkable. However, thankfully a contract is a contract. Past is like a son to me, in a very real and legally binding sense. The little shill studied his nails a moment, before cutting off a fresh slice of garp, and spreading some of the slurg on a cracker. He smiled as he took a bite, chewing thoughtfully, and Sunchaser's eyes narrowed. Past is my ward, and like all our employees, his guardianship not only entails a proper dowry, it requires one. Thankfully, now it's just the adults in the room, but I'm here to sell the sizzle. As well as the sausage? Oh, I can certainly sell the sausage. Alrada's smile had a veneer of pure sin, and more delight than Sunchaser found comfortable in a negotiation. So, we each have something the other wants, but I still plan to ensure Past has a good future. I'm sure your daughters are fine young women, but can they ensure he has a sound financial future? And he seems like a fine young man, without a lot of choice. Sunchaser slid her brunch closer, but refused to tuck in with an iron will. We both know the Marak-Tarn are small-timers, guarding a palladium mine out on an asteroid. They haven't set foot on Shill in months. Perhaps. Alrada canted his head ever so slightly. So, my dear, do tell me what the Natasha have to offer. I don't suppose they'd be willing to stay on Shill and offer their services. For the right price, of course. A surety for Past's future with your 4 girls. Sunchaser nearly blinked at the offer. It sounded like a work contract being waved under her nose from out of nowhere. That had possibilities. Still, it didn't do to seem backed into a corner. Oh, well, as to that, it happens we're in possession of a certain cultural asset. Sunchaser forced her a sire cup with a first-degree flip of certainty. Very valuable. Value is in the eye of the beholder. Alrada sniffed, but he leaned in a bit closer. I don't suppose you care to say how much value we're talking about? Sunchaser found herself leaning closer, slipping a generous slice of garp onto her plate. Enough to buy a fleet of ships. I know admirals, Alrada replied mildly, spreading a generous dollop of slurg on another cracker. He bit into it gracefully, but with a slight trace of satisfaction that had nothing to do with the taste. I don't suppose you'd mind if I had this cultural asset appraised? Fair's fair. You let me see the boy, after all. Sunchaser flipped her a psych in assent, but nodded, wondering where this was going. You have someone qualified in mind? Oh my, yes. One of the Taipool sponsors is an expert on such things. Alrada canted his head gracefully. We do trade in so much more than mere sex. The Taipool was founded to feed the soul. At a profit, Sunchaser snorted, but kept her amusement in check. There was no sense offending masculine sensibilities. Of course. Alrada's tongue flickered over his lips, and he blinked at her. He blinked. Blinked in a form-perfect Haresta Marakte, and she felt her sight quiver all the way down to her thorps. In that case,
nice.
Sunchaser reached for a plate and piled on another cut of garp, trying to quell the quiver inside.
Here's to a happy future for 5 wonderful young people.
Well, they survived a banquet together. Her host sniffed distastefully. I believe that's traditional for a peasant courtship.
Only if it's thrown by their families,
she said, biting into the succulent flesh as the taste rolled over her.
I must admit, I was surprised you arranged it.
It was a favor for a young lady of standing. Alrada canted his head openly. I believe your young lady was involved?
Mutual acquaintances?
Sunchaser blinked, despite herself.
Interfering in our business?
Regrettably, it happens now and then. Come now, you look famished after all of this business. Alrada was already filling another plate for her. Say what you would about the Shovanti, but at least he knew the way to a woman's heart. And yes, there was something to do with a professor, a human, I believe, though one of our own was involved.
I heard, Sunchaser said,
wolfing down another bite with a loud murr of satisfaction to show the food was acceptable.
Your waiters?
Oh, there certainly was that. Their dowries all rose substantially after that human wedding, and exposure to noble clients outside our establishment is at such a premium, with the Empress in mourning. Alrada reached for his drink and sipped it contentedly. But it was being catered by one of our ex-employees, who went out on his own. We were devastated to lose him. Occasionally a bit florid, but he's a marvelous chef.